gentlemen, welcome to the final plenary talk of our conference. And to introduce our plenary speaker, I have the pleasure of first introducing Professor Wang Jiyuan, who is the Chair Professor of the Department of Chinese and Bilingual Studies at our university. So, Professor Wang, please.
I'm giving a task of introducing a speaker who doesn't need introduction. Professor Zoltán Kövecses is a retired professor in the English department of the in Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, Hungary. His work on language and culture, emotion and metaphor has been inspiring scholars all over the world through his writing and his lectures in every part of the world. On a more personal note, in 2009, Professor Kövecses was invited here to a multiculturalism and multilingualism symposium for the China-Europe Forum. So he is actually among the first international scholars to visit us at our very young faculty. And on a more personal note, Professor Kövecses also inspired one of his former students at the Eötvös Loránd University to come here to win a Hong Kong PhD fellowship and completed her PhD on irony under my supervision. So I hope that he will also inspire you to send your best students to Hong Kong Poly in the future. So we're a bit of time for you to digest, but without much ado, I invite Professor Zoltán Kövecses.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the university and especially the organizers of the conference for inviting me to this wonderful city and to this wonderful conference. The title of my talk, as you can see, is some extensions of conceptual metaphor theory. Basically, I will be talking about two what I consider to be potential extensions and necessary extensions of conceptual metaphor theory. Let me lead into the issue with the help of a very brief overview of the major tenets of conceptual metaphor theory that everybody in this room knows. Conceptual metaphor theory is a cognitive theory of metaphor. One negative aspect of the early formulations of the theory was that it lacked a cultural component, although it was claimed to be also cultural even as early as metaphors were lived by, actually was not. And I think it is time to turn it into a fully cultural theory of metaphor as well. But more importantly, conceptual metaphors were regarded and are still regarded as sets of mappings between two domains of experience. And you have one domain with certain elements, you have another domain with other elements, and there are mappings between them, between the source and the target. And there are linguistic expressions that make those mappings manifest, so much so that the meanings of those expressions are based on the mappings that characterize a particular conceptual metaphor. More recently, relatively speaking, a major property of conceptual metaphor is that it is embodied, and the embodiment idea is reflected in the embodiment hypothesis, which basically boils down to correlations between subjective and sensory motor experiences as reflected as based on the two domains. So this would be, in a nutshell, a brief characterization of conceptual metaphor theory. And an example of this comes from my own work on anger. These are all examples probably well known, and they have been tested and found to be present in dozens of languages, including Chinese. These are the mappings that seem to characterize this metaphor, anger is fire. Also well known. So for example, kindle and inflammatory mean the causation of anger, burning and spitting fire and being ablaze mean or indicate a high degree of intensity of anger with probably fine distinctions between the intensity of indicated by these expressions. So, and last but not least, every one of us knows that, that there is some bodily experience that accounts for bringing together, why you bring together these two concepts, anger and fire. So that gives an embodied character to this metaphor. Now, what is the problem with this particular view of conceptual metaphor, which is the standard, or we can say the traditional view? In order to tell you about the problem, I want to take an example from the newspaper USA Today, which had carried an article about Lance Armstrong, a well-known American cyclist, and at some point in the article, a crisis manager says, to use an analogy from the Tour de France, he is still in the mountain stage and will be for some time. Maybe you will remember the scandal about Lance Armstrong. They did not find a drop of his blood, which was originally his. He was doping all over the place, and it was a terrible scenario for the sport of cycling. And then when it was discovered, he started eventually to make all kinds of confessions about his doping, and there was a big scandal. And then this crisis manager says this sentence: to use an analogy from the Tour de France, he is still in the mountain stage of making confessions and will be for some time. Now, there is a particular idea here to be expressed, which is that Armstrong has a long way to go and a difficult way to go to make all the confessions. And this is expressed by means of the in the mountain stage metaphor. Well, of course, the question that immediately comes to mind: what does mountain stage have to do with confessions? So how can we get from one to the other? This is a question that is not immediately answerable on the basis of the standard view of conceptual metaphors. Okay, so this is one problem as I see it. Another example comes from Alina Samino's example of from her 2008 book, a commentator on the 2005 G8 summit made a remark about the summit at that time and a rock concert happening simultaneously with the summit. Dr. Kumi Naido from the anti-poverty lobby group GCAP said after the roar produced by line 8, the G8 had uttered a whisper. So we have whisper, meaning faint-heartedness, meaning lack of resolve, meaning lack of determination. The political meaning of this was that, there was a very vehement protest against poverty on the part of the broadband, but the G8 summit had very little to say about that, and whatever he said, it sounded like a whisper. It was nothing. Again, we have the same issue. What does whisper have to do with faint-heartedness? What does it have to do with the lack of determination? What does it have to do with lack of resolve? So there are two, I think, important questions that arise on the basis of these two examples. One is, why are these metaphors unconsciously chosen? So why in the mountain stage, when the crisis manager is talking about Armstrong's making confessions, why is in the mountain stage chosen? And why is the word whisper used in connection with the lack of resolve of the GA summit? These are, especially in the second example, even if you would want to say, and as I will point, we can say something about in the mountain stage example in terms of conceptual metaphor theory, but there is very little that we can say about the whisper example, maybe nothing. We can't immediately link it to any conceptual metaphor, as far as I can tell. Yet, it is immediately obvious what the meaning is. So these are the two questions that I am trying to answer. Why are these particular expressions in the mountain stage and whisper selected? And I put unconsciously in parentheses because some of the people who write about this aspect of my work say that, oh, I'm claiming that this is consciously used. No, it is not the case. I've never thought of it that way. So I just want to make sure that this should be understood as unconsciously chosen. And secondly, how come that people can so easily understand such expressions that seemingly have nothing to do with a conceptual metaphor? How can they construct a completely valid interpretation, meaning for these expressions in context? To answer the first question, why are these particular metaphors used? Well, I wrote a book about this issue, where metaphors come from, and in that book I propose a contextual view of conceptual metaphor theory, which does not replace contextual metaphor theory. It extends conceptual metaphor theory. And I propose in that book that there are 4 major types of context that we need to take into account to explain such choices as I mentioned earlier. One is the situational context. The other is the discourse context. The third is what I call the conceptual cognitive context. And the fourth one is the bodily context. All of these, as this diagram tries to indicate, have both a global interpretation and a local interpretation. It's a very simple distinction. There is nothing major or earth-shaking about them. What it means is that when we use a particular metaphorical expression like whisper or in the mountain stage, this is happening in a very immediate local context. But there is also a larger global context, which simply consists of all the knowledge that people of a speech community have. However, in the local immediate context, there can be information, and most often there is information that is only available or accessible to the people who are in that local context, especially the speaker and the hearer. Okay, the situational context consists of some well-known, what I call contextual factors, cultural or social environment, and the physical environment, any kind of physical environment. And we will see an example for this soon. The discourse context, the immediately surrounding context is one kind of context. In linguistics, it is called context, or the knowledge about the main elements of the discourse that the speaker and the hearer share. So it can be knowledge about the hearer, it can be knowledge about the topic, but it can also be knowledge about the speaker himself, that the speaker can assume the hearer to know about. Previous discourses on the same topic, dominant forms of discourse and intertextuality. Okay, the conceptual cognitive context, a large part of this is simply the metaphorical conceptual system. That is all the conceptual metaphors that are conventionally present in a speech community's conceptual system. Ideology is another part of the conceptual cognitive context. So George Lakoff's work on moral politics and how our metaphors can be defined by our political views, ideologies like liberals and conservatives. That's the kind of thing that I have in mind here. But also knowledge about past events or knowledge about history or the memories of a particular community, and also our interests and concerns in particular speech communities. For example, Americans are well known to be sports lovers and dynamically oriented and so on and so forth, but that will have an impact on their metaphor use. Now, the bodily context is interesting because this is where embodiment is. And so, in my view, in this particular view, I do not consider embodiment and the body as something, unique to motivate particular conceptual metaphors. I consider embodiment coming from the body as context, as a context type. So if I have a metaphor device in my brain, the body is just one of the context types, as far as I'm concerned, that can motivate my choice of a particular metaphor in a particular context. So correlations in bodily experience are, for example, the clear example of what bodily context means in this context. Body specificities, this is what Casasanto is talking about when he distinguishes left-handers and right-handers and how handedness can define the metaphors that we use. Moral is right for right-handers, but it can be moral is left for left-handers. And bodily conditions, like there are many poets who can be blind, for example, and their blindness might define the way they use metaphors. Dickinson is a good example, who was not blind, but she had a major optical illness, and so on and so forth. So this is what I mean by the last two, the conceptual cognitive context and the bodily context, turn two aspects of conceptual metaphor theory and cognitive linguistics simply into a type of context. The conceptual system, especially the metaphorical conceptual system, and the body, which is captured in standard conceptual metaphor theory by the notion of embodiment, is for me a kind of context on a par with the situational context and the discourse context. So I cannot separate out the body from all the rest. Okay, so let's go back to the in the mountain stage example. So there's this specialistic crisis manager who has extensive knowledge about the topic of the discourse, which is Armstrong's doping scandal. And his knowledge includes his knowledge about the Tour de France, where Armstrong so successfully participated, and he has had to deal with the mountain stages of that race. And so what we can observe here is that the topic of the discourse, which is Armstrong being a cyclist participating in the Tour de France, can actually prime the speaker, in this case the crisis manager, to pick an element, a tiny little part of his vast knowledge of Armstrong and bicycle races and so on, to capture the idea that he has a long and difficult way to go in his confessions. This is the only way, to my mind at least, that we can account for a completely weird, otherwise completely weird example like in the mountain stage. This is unconventional, and yet we can connect it immediately to the rest of the discourse, and we understand why this is used, because we also made this connection. Obviously, if you know nothing about Armstrong, obviously, if you know nothing about the Tour de France, you will not be able to do this. But also, if you do know about this, then it's almost a natural choice for the speaker to use this particular metaphor, to unconsciously choose this particular metaphor. So that would be my way of responding to my first question as regards the in the mountain stage metaphor. Now let's see whisper. Whisper, it seems to me, emerges from the physical context. As I said at the beginning, the physical context includes anything that we can experience physically in the context. So he creates a metaphor, the speaker, the original speaker, creates a metaphor against the background in which there's a loud concert, rock concert, and a comparatively quiet summit meeting. And the original conceptualizer is prompted to use a perceptual property of the physical context to express a particular idea, in this case, lack of resolve or lack of determination or whatever. Okay, so these are two examples from two very different kinds of contexts that seem to account for the particular choices that the speaker makes. However, we are still left with the question of how can the speaker construct this meaning, and how can we construct a valid interpretation of this meaning, and that takes me to a much larger issue, which is seemingly a terminological issue, but it's much deeper than a terminological issue, namely the question of whether conceptual metaphors can be or should be formulated as what type of conceptual structures. Should we think of them as domains, whatever domains are? Should we see them as frames? Should we see them as cognitive models, or mental spaces, or image schemas, or scenarios, or scenes, or gestalts, and so on and so forth? So there's an abundance of terminology here, which I think reflects a great deal of confusion in the theory of conceptual metaphors about what are the important conceptual structures that we have in mind when we are talking about conceptual metaphors. And I would want to say that that probably all of them can be used in formulating particular conceptual metaphors, but I want to suggest that we should distinguish 4 levels at which these terms can be imagined. Image schemas at the highly schematic level, domains at a less schematic level, frames at a still less schematic level, and mental spaces as the most specific level of conceptualization. And what I know that you would immediately want to ask me, okay, what do you mean by domain and frame, and how do you distinguish them? I'm not really interested in that question. What interests me is that we have at least 4 levels in a hierarchy of schematicity or specificness. And the higher levels are always elaborated by more specific lower levels. Or the lower levels can always be schematized to more schematic conceptual structures like mental spaces to frames, frames to domains, domains to image schemas, and you can do the same thing down, but in that case you can say that image schemas can be elaborated as domains or aspects of domains. Domains can be elaborated as frames, and frames can be elaborated as mental spaces. So this is what I call a schematicity hierarchy, and my claim is that all of them are coherent organizations of human experience, with the important proviso that they are at different levels of schematization. But they are all present in a conceptual metaphor. So I would answer my own question by saying that that all 4, the image schemas, the domains, the frames, and the mental spaces are conceptual structures that participate in conceptual metaphors, but they are at different levels. And we will see what the importance of this in trying to answer the question of how we understand what those strange expressions like whisper and in the mountain stage mean. Let's see, in the mountain stage. So there is the idea at a certain point in the discourse to talk about Armstrong's confessions as being long and difficult, and it will take a long time, and it will take all kinds of difficulties for him to make them. And we need to express this. And you can say on the basis of standard conceptual metaphor theory that this is based on a well-known mapping in an equally well-known high-level conceptual metaphor, action is self-propelled motion, that impediment to motion corresponds to difficulty of action. So you can say that, but what the problem that remains is that there is still a gap, a big gap, between the metaphor, the linguistic metaphor in the mountain stage, and the action is self-propelled motion. And those conceptual gaps, or the distance between the two, must somehow be filled, must somehow be bridged. So let me try to do that by making use of the schematicity hierarchy, beginning with the topmost level, the image schematic level. It is well-known stuff. These are my not terribly sophisticated image schemas. The image schema for object, the image schema for verticality, and the image schema for movement, motion. They are not terribly nice, but that's how far my computer skills allow me to go. This is what we find, and obviously the relevant image schema for us is this one, in order to be able to talk about the in the mountain stage example. So what happens at the domain level then? Well, there are two domains that are somehow connected. One is the domain of communication, or to be able to link it more explicitly with actions at the higher level, communicative action, and self-propelled forward motion. Okay, so if you want to formulate it at a very high general level, if you want to formulate the metaphor, then you would have to say that communicative action is self-propelled forward motion. Okay, however, communicative action and communication can be, of course, a lot more specific. It can be specified, and as regards the target domain, you can specify it as a particular kind of communicative action, which is confessions, and the source domain as a particular kind of action, which is a bicycle race. So the conceptual metaphor at the frame level would become confessions or bicycle races. And at the mental spaces level, we have a very complex conceptual metaphor, which is the most specific of all of them. And interestingly enough, the specificity is indicated by the length of the metaphor itself. The length and difficulty of confessing wrongdoings is the length of difficulty of being in the mountain stage of the Tour de France. So notice that we have the schematicity hierarchy that looks something like this. You have the image schema level where you have activity is forward motion. You have the domain level where communication is self-propelled motion. We have the more specific elaboration of this, confessions or bicycle races. And then you have the completely specific mental space level formulation of a metaphor, which is this. And this is where the intended meaning is captured. The higher levels, the frame level, the domain level, and the image schema level are not capable of capturing the meaning of in the mountain stage. There is no way that you can do that. You need all of these things, and of course, you can ask, okay, what is the role of the image schema level? That's what makes the metaphor embodied. That's where we have the primary metaphor, action is motion, and so on and so forth. So you need that. What about whisper? Again, there is a huge conceptual distance between whisper and lack of resolve or lack of determination. So how can we bridge that? I don't think it's very easy to bridge the gap between whisper as a meaning and the conceptual metaphor. We have to do something ad hoc here. And probably the human conceptual system can do this kind of ad hoc creative meaning construction, in which you have a bunch of conceptual metonymies and the metaphor. So we can say that, okay, if whisper is about lack of resolve or lack of determination, then what we can say is something like emotion metonymically stands for determination to act. Emotional responses stand for the emotions. Angry behavior stands for angry argument. Roaring for intense angry argument. Whispering for non-intense angry argument. I say this in this way to make it a little more systematic. What I really mean is that obviously the G8 summit is also dissatisfied with poverty in the world, but they express this in a relatively mild manner in the form of a whisper. And so that's what I mean by non-intense angry argument. And you need a metaphor. Intensity is strength of effect. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is that there is no easy conceptual metaphor to capture this particular meaning that whisper indicates. We have to resort to something much more ad hoc. And maybe different people can do it differently. This is the way I could do it. But I ask myself, okay, how do I understand what whisper means? And I forced myself to make it completely explicit. This is what I came up with. But maybe other people would do it differently. They would create a different conceptual pathway. Or maybe we can insist that there is a schematicity hierarchy here as well. So if you want to push things, maybe you can come up with something like this. At the image schema level, you have intensity, strength of effect. In the domain level, behavioral intensity, strength of sound effect. And then at the frame level, you can have determination to act is strength of voice. And then you get down to the mental space level where you have lack of determination to act is lack of strength of voice. I find it a little bit forced. I am not sure that this would work at all. I am not sure whether you can turn it into a serious kind of account of how we come to whisper at a certain point in the discourse. So this is just an alternative, and I don't know the answer. Probably I would never know until experiments are done on issues like this. So in all of this, the notion of a conceptual pathway is very important. That is to answer the question of how can we construct a particular meaning for a completely unconventional expression requires what I call a conceptual pathway. And that conceptual pathway, to my present day knowledge, can be two kinds. One is either a schematicity hierarchy, as in the case of In the Mountain stage, or spontaneous mixed pathways. In other words, completely ad hoc combinations of all kinds of conceptual structures for whisper. And if this is the case, but as I said, I am not sure, these conceptual pathways produce context-induced systematic metaphors. as we saw in the case of in the mountain stage, or they produce context-induced non-systematic metaphors, isolated metaphors, as would be the case for whisper. But I am not so sure, because after all, we have examples like Lao Tai, and after all, we have examples like, that was just a little whisper, a mousy voice, indicating sometimes metaphorical meaning. So there is something maybe more systematic than what I was capable of showing you here. How do the contextual and the multi-level view, how do they fit together? And this is my diagram to indicate that. You have the image schemas, the domains, the frames, and the mental spaces, and what those double-headed, or I don't know what you call them, what those arrows indicate, both up and down, is that, and this is simply the claim of Foucault in his mental space theory. Mental spaces borrow structures from any of the higher levels, especially from frames. Okay, and the important point is that, and this is how context comes into the picture, context, that is the immediate situation, is obviously only relevant for mental spaces and the creation of meaning at the mental space level. We are not creating new frames, and we are not creating frames at the higher levels. We have them in long-term memory. Well, of course, we can come up with something that at the mental spaces level that may be turned into a frame later on after sufficient use. But the frames, the domains, and the image schemas are in long-term memory, as far as I can see. And the mental spaces are, the level of conceptualization where we construct meanings and we make use of those higher levels. And it is the mental space level that is the online situation where context can exert its influence. And so we insert whisper, we insert in the mountain stage. Now, what is the theoretical importance of all this? A number of authors, especially Ray Gibbs, make a very important distinction between what they can call embodied metaphors versus discourse metaphors. Basically, current metaphor research is divided along these two views of metaphors: embodied metaphors versus discourse metaphors. And in order to handle this kind of division in the field, I would suggest the following analysis of a third example, which is the example of, can I have 5 more minutes? So the example of capsize, as in the example, the 2005 hurricane capsized Domino's life. Okay, again, I am sure everybody understands what is meant here, although this is an unconventional linguistic metaphor, and we can also guess what the relevant conceptual metaphor is. Life is a journey, especially life is a sea journey. Okay, so far so good, but again, the question is, why is this particular metaphor selected? Why is it unconsciously chosen by the journalist when he describes what happens to Fats Domino, who is a former rock star, an old gentleman now, if he is still alive. He lives in New Orleans and he plays wonderful music, but in any case, he lived at the time of Katrina in New Orleans, and his house was devastated and so on. And the journalist, did an interview with him. Now, this about his life. Okay. Now, this is happening 2 years after the hurricane struck New Orleans, but the journalist explicitly states in the interview that there are many visible signs of the hurricane in New Orleans, even 2 years after the hurricane. So there's a large body of water, the sea, there are overturned boats, there are many other signs of devastation still visible. So, however, it seems that the physical situation in that interview situation is particularly relevant. And what I would like to suggest is that it is a perceptual property of that physical situation that primes the speaker to use the verb capsize. The overturned boats, the overturned houses, the trees, the telephone poles, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, simultaneously, when we understand this particular metaphor, we can create a schematicity hierarchy to understand what is meant, and we can capture the particular metaphor meaning with the help of this hierarchy, which looks like this. At the image schema level, we have at least two basic primary metaphors, actually self-propelled motion, and secondly, persisting or functionality is remaining direct. Now that is very important because that's the physical perceptual. It reflects, it is based on the physical property of the overturned boats on the sea. Now the domain is life is travel. Notice that I break away from the standard life is a journey formulation. I say life is travel at the domain level, and at the frame level, my suggestion is leading a life is journeying. Actually, I take this idea from the framework project of Charles Gilmore. He has a frame at the level of travel, and he notes in that frame that journey is a part of the travel domain. So I am using that idea to make clear that there is a schematicity difference between life is travel and leading a life is journeying. Journeying is an aspect, the actional aspect of travel. The travel is, of course, a lot more than journey. And at the mental spaces level, we have the very clear influence of the perceptual properties of the physical situation formulated here at the image schematic level as persisting or functionalities remaining direct, because what we can see is that there's devastation and everything is in shambles. So the mental space level metaphor becomes a sudden unexpected turn of events for the worse in one's life is the capsizing of one's boat in the course of one's sea journey. So this is the intended meaning at the most specific level, which makes it completely understandable, what capsize means, why it is used, and so on and so forth. I am convinced. I convinced myself. I don't know about you. Conclusions. The contextual view of metaphor extends conceptual metaphor theory to explain why particular linguistic and conceptual metaphors are used in discourse. On the one hand. On the other hand, the multi-level view of metaphor extends CMT to explain how particular metaphorical meanings arise online, how we are capable of coming up with valid interpretations of those expressions. The combined view offers a natural way to integrate the embodied and the discourse views of metaphor. Because in a way you can say that the contextual view of metaphor is a discourse view of metaphor. You can say that the schematicity hierarchy is the embodied view of metaphor, and you can merge the two, and if you merge the two, you can account for both of the questions that I raised. Contextual influence affects the online level. As a matter of fact, most of our metaphorical activity is obviously occurs at the level of mental spaces. It cannot occur anywhere else. It cannot occur at the frame level, the domain level, or the, but and this is my main point, this activity at the mental spaces level would not be possible without the higher level structures in the schematicity hierarchy. You need all of these things for a decent account of metaphor to my mind. Thank you.
So to us in context, the context A minutes until we have the B. And yeah,
I just wanted to say, I'm coming from a perspective where I prefer to see connections between different theories. Sorry.
Could you say it again?
And just speak loud, right? Okay, let me stand up. As you were talking, I was thinking about trying to find connections between what you were saying and what other people have recently said, because I suppose my own preference is always to find connections between different theories and approaches rather than oppositions. And so my question is, I saw a similarity between what you're saying and the multi-level view of figurativeness proposed by Switzer and Daxier in 2014.
It's not exactly the same thing. There are major differences.
I think what I want to ask is about the similarities, because I think it's really important for fields to try not to erect too many barriers, but actually trying to see that different people are trying to come up with relatively similar explanations. So one similarity is that. And the other thing that struck me was that your 4 different contexts say very similar things, and I'm seeing it as a good thing, not a bad thing. Say very similar things to the dynamic systems approach to metaphor, where metaphor use emerges from the dynamic interaction of different forces or constraints, which Ray Gibbs and Andy Stagman and Lynn Cameron talk about. So would you say that we are, even though there are different accounts, so we're actually coming up with relatively similar accounts of how metaphoristically works? So I wanted to focus on the similarities rather than the differences, even though I can see that your approach to your approach.
Absolutely. It's I can see all this as completely compatible with the dynamic systems approach. I feel I can do the same things that they can do. I can account for the same things that they can do using a different machinery. A different machinery, which to my mind is I should say, closer to the original ways of talking about conceptual metaphors than dynamic systems. And also, this is a much more pragmatically oriented approach than dynamic systems, although dynamic systems is also probably could explicate its premises as pragmatic. In terms of what we would call pragmatics, but probably on the other hand, I think we have to talk about the differences, and the big difference is I don't know how you would handle in dynamic metaphor, dynamic system theory, the issue of the body. I feel that the issue of the body and the issue of embodiment is naturally conceivable as a kind of context, and probably dynamic system theory would not think of the body as context, but as very different terms. But I don't know that. But basically, as I say, we are trying to move metaphor theory in the same direction, having the same goal, and eliminating and canceling all these divisions like discourse and embodied and so on.
Okay, unfortunately, we only have time for one question, and someone grabbed the mic already. So those who don't have mics, please ask and discuss on the cultural tool. One last question.
Sorry about this. Very quickly. I have a major
Could you speak into the
I have
microphone?
a major problem about conceptual blending theory, understanding it. Would you say that blending occurs at the image schema level?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Blending in this view is completely happening at the mental spaces level. And it can only occur there. After all, Foucault and Turner very strongly argue that there are dynamic theory, and dynamicity can only occur online at the level of mental spaces.
Okay, thank you. I know there are many questions. I hope we will have a nice discussion in the Zen-like context of the cultural tool in the Chinese garden and Similarly. Before we go to the conclusion session, we have a gift to give to our speaker. It's a fan from our faculty because we are all your fans. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Zoltán. And we are almost at the end of festivities, but before that, we got a couple of things left to do. First of all, I would like to invite Andreas, Professor Andreas Rosol, not just to